Hi guys, how is it going? Good evening to everyone, and today we will be learning about a few of the remaining topics in grid, which is the areas in grid. And let's um, let's wait a couple of minutes and let everybody join in. And in the meantime, you guys can let me know how have you been doing, and were you guys able to try out some things using grid and flexbox. Yeah, I'm doing good as well, and not exactly, this isn't the last class, but in terms of the major topics that we plan to cover, I mean in terms of concepts, yes, you can think of it as one of the last classes, but we'll be learning more things as we progress, right? Okay, so let's start with today's session. So I have over here an index.html. We have created a container class and it has some items in it. Okay, first item, second item, third item, and so on. Okay, and then there's this style class where we have defined our container class, and these are the properties: display grid. We have some columns, rows, and gap, and we have set the content of the grid to the center. Then for the items, so let me just open this in the browser real quick. And then for the items, we have we are setting it to display grid once again, and we're placing all the content in the center, right? So let me just uncomment this for now so that you guys can notice the difference, and let me just keep the background. So comment and comment this out. All right, so you can see that we have this grid structure with us, and it just has this background. Now yesterday we were facing the issue that we wanted to center this particular item in the middle, right? And for that purpose, if we look at uh, the structure of these items, okay, right here in the developer tools. So if we notice over here, this is the container, right? And this is what is setting everything. This is what is creating a grid, and these are the items within the grid, right? But if you notice over here, this is another item within this particular element, right? So this first item, this text, this is the content for this particular element. For this grid, these all of these items collectively, they make up the content, right? So when we say justify content to the center, it is basically telling where to start the grid from, right? Where to start the first, this point, where to start this point from, the starting point. So if I give it start, for example, it it lays out all of the rows and columns from the beginning. If I specify this as end, right, it lays things out from this end. And when we specify center, there's equal spacing on both the sides. Okay, so this is what the justify content does. And similarly, we have align content, which would vertically do the same thing, right? Now there's another property which says justify items, and when we specify that, it is basically justifying all the items, or these particular things So this is our grid, and within that grid, it is justifying all of those items in the center, right? So we have the same values where this item should start from. If we wanted to start from the end, you can see that it is aligning itself towards the end of each, row and column. But the spacing is lost because, grid, when it will only occupy the space when by default the value for this is stretch, right? So this is the default value. When we specify something other than stretch, it will try and fit, position that content at that particular level, and also it will only take up the space which the content requires. Okay, only that much space. That is why we see a loss of, these. You can only see that this background blue color is only coming for the amount of space required for the content. So the correct way to achieve what we want to do is we display these individual items, right? And this is the content within this item. So we have two options. Either we say display this item as flex, right? And then we say align items center and then justify content center. So that is how we are achieving this, right? Or the other option is that we set display to grid and then we just say place content center. All right. So since this itself is another element and these are the contents for it, if we display set the display for this as grid, we can internally make use of the justify properties and specify where the grid should be created. So we can either make use of place content or place items. Both will have the same effect. All right. So anyways, this is what these changes were about. Let me uncomment the change from below as well. And similarly, what we want to do is we will look at the next property, right? What we want to be able to do is, suppose what we want is this first item, it should span uh, two it should span into two columns, right? So there's the possibility to define this as well. Let's see how we can do that. So let's create a class called first and we will make use of the property grid column. All right, so that this particular item, it takes up two column space of two columns. All right, and so we make use of this grid column property and then we say span. Okay, how many columns do we want it to span? So by default it is one. All right, and we assign this class to the first item. So if we take a look at this now, there is no change, right? And the moment I change this from 1 to 2, you can see that the first item, instead of spanning just one column, it is spanning two columns and rest of the items have shifted accordingly. Okay, let's inspect this in the developer tools and let me turn on this. So you can see that originally we were saying that we did not specify any values, right? So the first item was only taking up this much space, right? It was only occupying this grid cell, right? When we are saying, so this is the first column, second column, third column, right? So we have a column template. We are specifying 3 columns right over here and 2 rows. Okay, so now we have, when we say that the grid column should span, how many columns it should span, so we are specifying that it should span 2 columns, right? So that is why it is taking up the first column as well as the second column. If I change this to 3, for example, you can see that the first item is taking up the entire first column, right? Sorry, the entire first row, and it's spanning across all the 3 columns. All right. So 1, 2, and 3. So that is how you can span across different columns. Now, similarly, what I want to do is I want this second item to span across, multiple rows. Okay, the second row as well. So the way I can do that is, let me create a class second, and I can specify grid row like this, and then I can say span to, right? And if we do a refresh, and oh, I forgot, I need to add this class to this item, right? So that this grid row property is set for this particular item. So I have now applied this class, and you can see that this item is now spanning 2 rows. This was the first row, this is the second row, right? So it's spanning 2 rows now. And since no space is available for this item, it has automatically been shifted to a new row, right? If we look at the structure that we have specified for this grid, so we have only defined 2 rows, okay, of 300 pixels, and the next row occupies 40% of the available space. Now it has implicitly created a new row, right? And since a new row has been created and a size is not defined for it, it assumes the size of that grid to be auto, which basically means that it will only occupy as much height as required by this content. Suppose we want to define a width sorry, a height for the row which has been created implicitly or automatically been created. We can make use of another property which is known as grid auto rows. And suppose we want all the rows which have been created automatically, right, to take up 300 pixels. We can make use of this property, and let me save this. And now you can see that this fifth item which was created implicitly, right, if we inspect it, it has the dimensions of hang on a second. Yeah, if we see this item, it has these dimensions. The width is 200 and the height is 300. Let me show you by adding another item, right? And you can see even this item is taking up a space of 300 pixels in terms of its height. So whenever you want to suppose we leave out this property, right? So all of these rows have been created implicitly. What implicit means is that we are not specifying the dimensions for each row or how many rows there would be, right? So in that case, we can make use of this property grid auto rows and give a predefined space which this row would take up. Similar to this, we also have grid auto columns, right? So if we just specify the rows and do not specify any columns, we can make use of the grid auto uh, columns property, and you can see that now each column will take up a space of 300 pixels. You can see that this column is 300 wide, this one is also 300 wide, right? So that is how for implicitly created items you can see that we can define the dimensions using these two properties. All right. Okay. Now the next property that we are interested in is the areas. So far what we have seen is that this is our grid, right? So let me just go over the terminology really quick. These are lines, correct? Line number 1, line number 2, line number 3. These are the lines for the columns. And similarly, we have, this is the first line for the row, this is the second line for the row, right? So these are rows, and then these are columns. Then the intersection of, uh, and the spaces between, this first line and the second line, this defines a track. And wherever a row track and a column track intersects, basically, or these lines intersect, this is known as a grid cell, right? So this box is a grid cell, this entire box is a grid cell, and then this entire box is a grid cell. So we have multiple grid cells over here defined, right? So what we can do is we can combine multiple of these cells and call them as an area, right? So right now you can see that when we have made use of the span property, we have somewhat created a area for this first item, right? So this first item occupies this much area. So an area can consist of multiple grid cells, right? So far we have seen how to, create areas, or spread the contents, uh, spread these, basically define where, how much space this, particular element would take up. So now let's see how we can, create named grid areas, and tell each item which particular area it needs to occupy. Okay, so suppose what we want to do is we want to build up a layout which is like this. Okay, this is a pretty common layout which you guys might have seen. There's a header section, there's a side nav, there's a content area, and there's a footer. This is a very common website layout which you might have come across at some or the other point of time. Let's see how we can build such an area, or build such a layout using grid, right? So what we will do is, let me create a new folder, grid areas. All right, let's create a file, index.html, and a style.css. And let's call this as grid areas, and link the CSS file, style.css. And what we will do is, let's create a div. Let's give it the class container. And then what we are trying to do is we want to create this kind of a layout, right? So let's add a header element. Then we have a side which we will be using for the side nav. Then we have our content, and then we have a footer. All right, so these are the elements which we have created. Let's add some text: header, side nav, content, and footer. All right, like this. Let me just stop this and restart the server with this particular thing. So you can see these are the elements which we have created. Now very quickly, let's add some styling for this. So the first thing that we will do is, for all the elements, we want to set the box sizing to border box. Then for the container, we will say display grid. Okay, this is very familiar. You guys are pretty familiar with this part, right? Then we will say grid template columns. We want to repeat, we want to create 4 columns, and we want them to take up a fraction of the available space, right? Each of these 4 columns will take up a fraction of the available space. Then we want to define rows. So we are saying that the first row, right, which is for this, we will say that this should take up as much space as the header requires. Similarly, for this particular row, we will say it will take up one fraction, and then this will take up as much space as it requires. So both of these will take up as much space as it requires, and this will take up majority of the remaining space. Okay, so for that we will say auto one fraction and auto once again. Okay, and then we have let me close this. We have this kind of a structure with us. Okay, and what we want to do is let's give this a height of 100 vh. All right, and what we want to do is so this particular container will take up the entire viewport height, right? Whatever is the visible height that we can see right now, that is the height which will be set for this particular element. Okay, this container element. And then for the sake of better understanding, let's do one thing. Let's give color to all of these elements. So we'll say header color, not color, background. Actually, we'll say it has a background of light pink. Then we have the main, which has a background of light blue. Then we have a side, which is for the navigation, side nav, and it has a background of coral. And similarly for the footer, we have a background which is light golden rod yellow, for example. Okay, so these are all the different colors which we have specified. Okay, and then what we want to do is give me a second. So we have these, basically these values available. Next, what we want to do is we want to define uh, the number of areas, right? So let's take a look at how we can do that. So there's this property known as grid template areas, and we can pass it a string. So what we want is that the first, in the first row, all the columns should be occupied by the header, right? So we will say, since we have a 4-column layout, right? So we will say over here header, 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 and header. So this space defines the difference between each of the columns. So it's, you can specify the value for each of the we can give a name for this particular column, right? So the first row has 4 columns, and we want all of these 4 columns to be occupied by the header. Okay, so we are naming a area. All right, if it's not clear to you, you will understand in just a little bit. Then for the next row, what we want is that, So once again, the next row also has 4 columns, right? So if we look at this example, so we can see that the site nav occupies 1 column, then the remaining 3 columns would be occupied by the content. So let's do that over here. So we are saying that the first column is occupied by the site nav, the remaining 3 columns are occupied by content, right? And similarly, let me move all of this in one line. The last column is taken up by the footer. Okay, sorry, the last row is taken up by the footer, so all of the 4 columns will occupy the footer. Okay, so we have defined all of these areas. So first area is header, the next area is side nav, and the third area is for the content, and then for the footer. And then we are basically specifying how many columns each of these areas will take up. Okay, now let's take a look at how we can tell each item which area to take up, right? So for the header, we'll make use of the property grid area and give it this name which we are specifying over here. These are just some names. Okay, this has nothing to do with the this name basically, right? So we are saying that this particular element, the header element, from here it should take up the area defined by this header area, right? So we will give the grid area as header. If we come back over here, you can see that this entire, you can see that it has somewhat stretched this particular thing. Then let me check something. Style.css style. Okay, yeah. Then for the main area, we will say grid area, and then we will specify content, right? And similarly for this one, grid area, we will specify side nav, and lastly for the footer, grid area as footer, like this. Let me just check why aren't the changes being reflected. So we are saying display grid template columns. We want to repeat all of these. We want 4 columns, 1 fraction, and grid template rows should take up auto, 1 fraction, and auto. And then we have defined all of these areas, given them a height. Give me a sec. Are we missing something? So we have our body, we have linked the style sheet. Give me a moment. This is, so we have the header, we have the aside, we have the main, and the footer is just not creating the grid as expected. Let me just stop this. Okay. All right. Open with live server. Let me check once. This should have worked as expected, but for some reason it isn't. Let me quickly cross check what could be the issue. Grid template columns, grid template rows. All right. So we have our div with the container class, then we have the header, side nav, main, and the footer. Then we have our style.css over here. And then we're saying all the elements have a box sizing of border box. The margin has been set to 0. Display grid template columns repeat. Let me just copy and paste this because I don't want to waste more of your time. Then we have the header. What seems to be the problem? All right, give me a sec. So let's just go over this once again. So I have this container class, right? There's a header, a side, main, and a footer. Then we have, as usual over here, define that the display is grid. We specify that we want 4 columns, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then we specify that each of the rows should take up a fraction of the space and the other rows should take up auto width, right? So basically this is taking up as much width, as much height as it requires, and this much is taking up as much height as it requires, and then this particular row is having a fraction of the space which is remaining, right? Then we define the grid template areas, which is header, header, header. So we define that all of the 4 columns should take up this space. Then we specify that in the next row, only the sidebar should take up the space and the rest of the column should be taken up by the content. And similarly, for the last row, all of it is being taken up by the footer. And we specified that this entire container has a vh a height of 100 vh, which is the viewport height. Let me just comment out this code, which I will explain to you guys later. So you can see that this has just something to do with it is just to display all of the contents in the center, add some padding, and define the font size. And over here we just specified that this particular element, which is the header, it is taking up the header area, and then this is the footer and sidebar and content and so on. I think I just realized the mistake that I was making. So the mistake is that if we look at this code, when I was defining the areas over here, right, I was specifying the names of the areas in double quotes. Okay, so that was the mistake which I was making. Now let's correct this. Okay, so this, whenever you're specifying the area, it needs to be without the double quotes. So therefore it was not able to find these areas which we had defined earlier. Okay, and now if we save this, you can see that uh, all of this has been created. So I just made a mistake over here. This needs to be called side nav, right? This name and this name needs to match. Let me save this, and we can see that all of the elements have been laid out correctly. If we inspect in the console, right, you can see that this header, right, it is taking up 4 columns as we had defined. Now the advantage of using this, this way of creating things is that right within the CSS you can see the placement of each of these elements. This is, basically you're defining your layout right here. Okay, so I know we had a bit of a mess up over here, but is the concept clear to you guys, like how we defined rows and columns, and how then we assigned each element to a particular area? Okay, we defined over here, like this element, this is the area which it is going to be taking up, then this element will occupy the content area. Okay, and this is how we have specified the space which this is how we have defined an area basically. Okay, so for example, what I want is that uh, let's do one thing. Let's add a bit of more styling over here. So to make it look a bit better, what we will do is we will say that whatever is inside the container, right, all of the children of the container class, we will just give it some padding of 16 pixels. We will say that the display is grid and the padding is 16 pixels. Similarly, the font size, we are defining a font size of extra large, and let's make it a bit bold. So let's make use of the font weight property. Let's set it to 600. This is a unitless property, and let's give it a color of dark slate blue like this. You can see we have some padding, but there's some extra space which is coming from the style sheet. So we can just specify that the margin should be 0. Now you can see that everything is sticking. And then since we want to align all of the content to the center, we will say place content to the center like this. So we have everything in the center. Now suppose what we want is that we do not want to show a particular element, right? So we can very easily if we do not want any element to take up that space, we can just replace that particular uh, area by a dot. So when we specify a dot like this, you can see that this space has become vacant. Now, since this element is occupying some or the other size, it has been moved to the side, right? But this is how you can have one or more dots to specify a empty area like this. So this is one of the features. Now suppose what we want is when we go below 500 pixels, right, when our screen size is small, what we want is that we don't want this side nav to be visible. Instead, we want this content to take up the entire space, right? So let's see how we can do that. let's put back the side nav in place so you can see it as visible over here now. And then the next thing that we will be doing as um, let's create a media query over here. And we will say media screen. If you don't specify anything, this will be applicable to everything. And we will say width. When the width is less than or equal to 500, in that scenario, what we will do is we will, let me just copy this and paste it here. All of the properties, we want them to be as it is. We just want to change the layout. We want that the content should take up all the space, right? And then the aside element, we will say that the display should be set to none for this element. Okay. And yeah, so these are the things which should happen when the size goes below 500 pixels. Now let's move into the responsive mode. Let me dock this to the side, right? And as you can see, it is already responsive, right? All of this is entirely responsive. Let me zoom this a bit for you guys. And the moment we go below 500, let me refresh this. Okay, I think I made a mistake. I did not specify the dimensions for this. Yeah. So the moment we are going below 500, you can see that space has been replaced. And another thing that we need to do over here is say container. Yeah, within the container, when there's this aside element, it needs to be hidden, right? So as we are reducing the size, you can see that the side nav has been hidden. Okay, so you can very easily create a layout like this, and on smaller screens you can get rid of the side nav. I think this is something which you guys might have come across quite a lot, right? So using this way of defining layouts using CSS grid is pretty convenient, and you can pretty much see the structure of how each element within the layout would be visible on the screen. Just looking at this, you can figure out, okay, this is how it's going to look on the screen as well, right? Header, side nav, content, and footer. So it's pretty clear with this. So I think this is one of the most useful features of CSS grid, and I encourage you guys to try it out. So this is what I wanted to teach you guys with regards to CSS grid. There are a few more topics. You can go through those in the resources which have been provided along with the assignments. Okay, but these were the key topics which I have covered in the previous day and today's session with regards to grid. Yeah, so I mean, you can make use of media queries and it will become responsive. Then the next thing that we want to do is let's quickly fix the issue that we were facing yesterday, right? I think I already gave you guys a solution, but let's implement that really fast. So let's go live with, so this is where we had left off the portfolio, right? And we wanted to align this content in the center, right? So let's do that. And by the way, if you guys are looking for the link to this portfolio, it's in the description of the video. All right. Okay. So we are here in the index.html, and we have our style file over here. We had created a section, this particular technologies, this over here. For this, we had set the display to grid for this element, right? Let's go to that element, and if you notice over here, all of the other sections have their headings in the center, so we had kind of broken this part out. So the first thing that we will do is create a section and move it inside here, and let's give this the ID of section as well. Let's give it that ID, and let's give a class over here. Let's call this as container, and let's move all of this inside this section. So we have the technologies, and we have this kind of a thing right now. The next thing that we want to do is let's replace this with the container class, as this has kind of broken the layout which we had created, right? Let me zoom this out a bit. Okay. All right. Then what we want to do is we want to center this, right? So once again, the structure is somewhat similar. And let's get rid of the responsive mode. So if we look at this over here, this is our grid, right? And these are the items which are inside the grid. Now this itself has multiple elements, right? And what we want is we want to center whatever is inside this particular element. Now this is neither display flex nor display grid. So if we want to center something, either we have the option of using text align center, but if we want to do it using the flex box or the grid way, we have to give this element the display as flex or grid, and then use those properties of alignment to fix this particular issue. So what we will do is, since we have already defined this as a grid, let's look at an example of how we can make use of flexbox. So you can have a display flex inside a display grid, or you can have another grid over here. So we will say display flex, right? So you can see all of the heading and the header and this particular section, it has all come in the same row, right? Because we have set display flex and the default direction is row. What we will do is we'll say set the flex direction to column. So now you can see once again they're stacked in separate columns, right? And we want to justify the content to the center, and then we want to say align items to the center as well. And you can see now that all of these are coming in the center, and we had defined this class, that is why all of the headings are already coming in center. We no longer need this, so we can get rid of this class, right? And you can still see it as being shown the way it was, and we can see that there is this extra margin which is coming, but we have already defined a padding over here, right? So let's get rid of that extra margin. So instead what we will do is, let me add that class once again, and let me just specify margin as 0. So you can see that it is now neatly aligned, right? The other thing that we wanted to do is we want to be able to let's add some more effects to this. What we want to do is we want to change the size of this blur kind of thing, we whenever we are hovering over this element, what we want to do is that we want to move it slightly to the top, and we want to increase the shadow, so that it kind of gets that lifting kind of an effect. So any idea on how we can do that? And for the time being, let me do one thing. Let me just switch to the light mode. It's just easier right now to work with the light mode, so that you guys can see all the shadows correctly. So this blue kind of looks ugly on in the light mode, right? So let's define a, yeah, the answer is correct. We can use a combination of translate, transform. So yeah, that is correct. Let's define some more colors. So what we want to do is, let's create a shadow color. Let's make use of HSL 225, which is a shade of gray, and we want it to be 10% saturated and 83% light. So we want a lighter shade, right, of gray. That is why we are specifying the value over here as 83%, right? And the next thing that we want is, let's create a darker variant of this, right? Shadow color dark, and we want to give this value as 63%. So you can see that it is a bit more darker than the previous value. And let's define some spacing as well. So spacing regular, let's keep the spacing in pixels and the font sizes in rems, okay, like this. And we will specify spacing small. It will be half of this, right? So there is another property known as the calc, which allows us to do some sort of mathematical calculations within CSS. So we can say that var spacing regular, and we basically, let me get rid of this, and we just divide this by 2, okay? So whatever is this value, it divides it by 2. And if you want to perform some sort of mathematical calculation, right, within CSS, you can make use of this calc function, okay? So basically it calculates whatever is there. Then what we want to do is, on the, so let's give this color to our element over here, shadow color, like this. So you can see that it has this shadow color now, okay? I have to set the rendering mode once again. Give me a minute. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we have this shadow color. The next thing that we want to do is, and quite frankly, let's change this value a bit as well. What we want to do is, when we are hovering over this element, right? So we will say card on hover. We want to change the not the padding, the box shadow. So let's copy this. When this happens, we want to give it the dark value when we are hovering over it, and let's increase these values over here. Let's set this to 8, and let's set this to 9, for example. So if you notice, when we are hovering on this, it is becoming, it's spreading out more, and it has a darker color. Then the next thing that we want to do is we want to transform, and let's make use of the translate y function. We wanted to move up slightly, and in order to do that, what we will say is let's make use of the calc function. And actually before that, let's use the variable which is spacing. Let's use the small spacing over here. Okay, translate y, transform, translate y. Did I make a mistake somewhere? What are we calling this? Spacing small, right? Let's inspect this. And if you notice that now as we're hovering over this, this is moving down, not the effect that we wanted. We wanted it to move up, right? Since we wanted to move up, we need to give a negative value, and you can't do something like this. This has no effect. We can't say minus and get a negative value. So there's a workaround for this. We make use of the calc function and we say -1 times whatever is the value. So we multiply it by -1 to get a negative value. And now when we hover over this element, you can see that it's going up, right? And the shadow is sort of increasing. Another thing let's do over here, that we'll give this a border radius, and let's make use of the spacing regular variable. All right, so it has this rounded edge over here. And to make this, this entire effect smooth, let's make use of a transition. We want to add a transition right now on the transform property. Let's give it 0.4 seconds to complete this transition. Let's make use of ease in, and the next property is the box shadow, right? And similarly, even for this 0.4 seconds, and we will say ease in and ease out. And now when we are hovering over this, it has a very nice effect, right? So this is how you can achieve something like this. And obviously it is responsive, and we have this effect as well. So this is how you can, update your portfolio, make use of all the things which we have learned so far. And yeah, we'll work more on this portfolio going ahead and fix all of the other sections as well, and improve the portfolio, and also give a better theming for the light and dark mode as well. Okay, so before moving on to the next topic, let's take a break right now. All right, and if you guys have any questions, you can let me know in the comments. Okay, there's a question: when we are hovering over the cards, they're about to touch the navigation. Yeah, we can see that this is, kind of moving ahead. Let's see what is the issue. I think this is kind of sticking, right? So I guess it's happening because of this header. And then we can see that this header has this position as sticky, right? So we had written a very generalized rule. Let's fix that. Let's search for the header class, right? So this one, and we also have a header right here. Let's do one thing. Let's give this a class of header, and then let's move this rule from element level to class level, and you can see that now it's not over going ahead of the header even when we are hovering on this or otherwise. So it's better to make use of class based rules, and the more specific your rule is, the better it is. All right, otherwise we come across such kind of issues where things are overlapping. And another thing, if you guys notice, is that when we are clicking on any particular thing, right, the heading for that thing is basically being hidden because some space is being taken up by this header, right? So let's try and fix that as well. So the heading gets hidden whenever we select a particular section from our navigation. Let's fix that. So we have another property available to us known as scroll margin top, right? So we have set the scroll behavior to smooth, and then we have this property known as scroll margin top. So for that, what we will do is we have our sections with us. Okay, so let me check. Let's search for the section container and then section. We have nothing specifically for a section, right? So we have our section with us, and we say scroll margin, and we say top. So we know that let's give this 100 pixels, right? So whatever it is scrolling to from the top, let me refresh this. Now you can see that the heading is visible, right? But still there's a bit of a gap. So let's try and reduce this gap. So what this is doing is that from the amount of scroll that it is doing, from that it should leave a margin of somewhere around 100 pixels, right? Let me close this. Okay, and then what we want to do is we want this gap to be reduced slightly, so let's make use of the calc function, and we will say that we want to reduce this space. We know that the header is taking up, this has a padding, right, of somewhere around 16 pixels on the top and 16 at the bottom. So we will make use of the variable which is spacing regular. The size for this is 16 pixels, so we want twice of that, so we'll say 2 times, and then we want this calculation to happen first, and from 100 pixels we will reduce this amount. Let's do a refresh, and now if we try to scroll to say hobbies, you can see that it's this much space is. Let me give the header border for now, and we'll fix this up later on as we proceed. Border 1 pixel solid. Okay, so you can see that this is where the header is ending, and if we now select the technologies, this is much better compared to before, right? We can see the heading at the right spot, right? So all of the heading text is not being cut, and we are landing at right about the correct place. Okay, so this is how you can set the offset for the scrolling as well, like the amount before where it actually reaches this section and how much before that it should stop the scrolling. Okay, so you can do that using the scroll top sorry the scroll margin top property. From the top, how much margin it should leave. All right, are there any more doubts you guys can ask in the comments? Okay, so I'm assuming there are no doubts. Let's move on to the next topic. All right, so we have covered all of the grid related things. We can go over the transform scale related doubt in the Discord channel after this class. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the code for that. Let me minimize this window. So the next topic that we will be learning is related to JavaScript, and let me create a file over here before we get started. Index.html, then we have a main.js. All right. So the topic that we will be learning is scope chain and the execution context, right? Okay, let's run this. So let's understand the execution context first. Okay, so a couple of things we need to understand. Let me also link the script tag main.js. So the first term that we will be understanding is known as the lexical environment. So suppose we take a look at the code from our portfolio, right? We have this piece of code. It has these functions, and there is this particular piece of code. We have these functions, have these statements, and variables are defined. So let's understand the term lexical environment. So lexical basically means it has something to do with words, right? And what it also means is so when I say lexical environment, what it means is that uh, where you're writing something, or where a statement is placed, based that where it is placed, right, where you're writing the code, that is very important. So to understand that, let's take a look at an example. So for example, I have a function over here. Okay, and it says print me, for example. All right, and then we say let's create a variable where a equals to, for example, and then we are saying console.log a, right? Then we are calling print me, And then once again we're saying console.log a. Okay, what do you expect the output to be? What do you guys expect to see as the output? Can let me know in the console, the console in the comments. Okay, so the output, the expected output is 2. So you can see that when this statement was executed, it called the print me function, and it had access to this variable. And over here also, when we're saying console.log2, so you can see 2 has been printed twice. Now this was pretty straightforward. Now let me make a slight change to all of this. Let's do this. Let's bring this variable inside, and let's save this. Okay, and you can see, hang on a sec, I think I have a debugger. Yeah, let's do a refresh, and you can see that when we're calling print me, right, and now we're saying console.log a, for this one variable a is accessible. And when we're saying console.log over here, it's printing the value 2, but when we are saying console.log a over here, it's giving us an exception, right? So where you write something that is of importance, that is what is meant by the lexical environment. So the lexical environment specifies that where you write something that has some significance, right? Physically, wherever that statement is present, it makes a difference. It makes a difference in terms of, where something is accessible. If I place this statement over here and if I do a refresh, it is accessible, you know to this function as well as, this statement over here. But if I move this, it has a consequence, right? So this is known as the lexical environment, right? So let's understand the, difference between the two things, why this one is not working for this statement, right? And when we have this variable over here, why this is working. So in order to understand that, we need to understand the something known as the execution context, right? So this over here, this is a, lexical environment, right? This over here, this entire thing is a lexical environment of sorts. And to clearly understand lexical environment, let me just, get rid of this code. We have this empty JavaScript file. Okay, so we have something known as the uh, global execution context. Now let's see what a execution context is. There might be many lexical environments, right? So if we look at this example, the difference between these two statements is this, that this variable is present inside this function, right? So it's not in the same lexical environment as this statement, correct? Okay, that is why this function, this variable is only available within this function. If we move this variable outside, you can see that this function and this log statement, they're all at the same level. The moment we create a function and we have this opening and closing curly bracket, this sort of defines a different lexical environment. So in order for a variable to be accessible, it has to be on the same lexical environment. And you know the thing which is responsible for executing this particular code is known as the execution context, right? So this is one lexical environment, this entire thing, and this is another lexical environment. So we have an execution context for these set of statements, and we will have a new execution context for whatever is within this function. Okay. Let's understand this a bit more, better with some more examples. Let me just clear this out. So by default, we have something known as the global execution context. So far what you need to understand is whenever a block of code or a set of statements needs to be executed, a execution context is created. All right. This context is responsible for executing that particular piece of code, and also it does certain things in the background. The most basic level of execution context is the global execution context. So right now we have no code over here. And if we refresh this, there is nothing is being printed, there is no code. So an execution context consists of three things basically. It has a reference to the global object. So our JavaScript code is running inside this browser, right? And the browser is represented by the window object. All right. So the global object is known as the window object. That is the first thing. So each execution context has three things, right? Number one, the global object. Okay. The next thing that it has access to is the this variable. We look at this as well. And the third thing which it has is the access to the outer environment, a reference to the outer environment. Okay, these are the three things which are available within an execution context, right? Let me just comment this out. So the very base level execution context is the global execution context, which is nothing but uh, the thing which is running our JavaScript code, right? Which would be the browser, and the browser has something known as a JavaScript engine. Okay, the JavaScript engine is responsible for executing the JavaScript code within our website. All right. So at the very basic level, we have the global execution context. Now let's look at the global object. The global object is the window object, which is basically this entire object. Sorry, this window, right? The instance of this window. Then, as I mentioned, we also have access to a special variable known as this. So if we type this over here, it's the same, the same window object, right? And then since this is the outermost thing, there is no such thing as the outer environment in case of the global execution context. Now let me do one thing. We have that code which we had written earlier. So we had var a equals 2, and then we had this function print me, right? And we are just saying console.log a and console.log a like this, right? Now if we look at the global object, right, and if we expand this, you can see that we have this variable being created at the global within this global object, right? So if I say this is the same thing, okay, and it should also have the reference to our function. So if we want to access a property, we specify dot, and then when we say print me, right, you can see that this function is also defined on this object. So at the very base level, we have this, this environment which is responsible for executing our code, which is known as the global execution context. And you can see that this object basically has all of the variables and the functions which have been defined available on it. Okay, so this is the very base level of the execution context. The and another thing, so you guys might be wondering, what is this global object? So whenever we say global, it means in terms of JavaScript, it means that it is accessible to everyone, and we can have multiple execution context as well, right? So when this print me function is called, right, it creates a separate execution context. And because this variable is defined on the global object, right, it has access, it is accessible even within the print me function. So whenever we create a new function and that function is called, a new execution context is created separately for that function. All right, then let's take a look at how different execution contexts are created. um, so for example, what we need to understand is, let's take another example and let's see if you guys have understood this properly. So we will say console.log some variable, right? And let's create a function. Let's call it as some function. Over here we will just say from some function, and we will log the value of some variable. And this is where we are actually declaring this some variable like this. And then we are saying, let's call some function, okay, and this is equals to, for example, Devsnest. All right, so if you look at this, let me zoom this a bit for you guys. So this statement was executed, right? In most other programming languages, you cannot do something like this. Okay, we have the variable being used before it is being declared. This is the declaration, correct? And we are trying to use the function. And for example, let me also move this function call over here. Okay, so you can see that when this statement is being executed, JavaScript is going through with this. Okay, it's not throwing us any error. The declaration is happening later on, and we are able to use the variable before declaring it. And similarly, the function has also been defined later on, and we are invoking the function before it has been defined, right? So how is this possible? We have something which is created over here, but we're able to still access it. And you can see that when we are logging this over here, it is specifying the value as undefined, and then we are calling some function and it is saying from some function, and the value for some variable is being logged. And over here also you can see that this is undefined, right? So how is this possible? So this is possible through something known as hoisting, right? So this is a feature in JavaScript wherein you can, before you declare a variable, you can use it, and similarly before you define a function, you can, invoke it, right? But how is this working? How is this, possible? So it's possible because of the execution context. What we need to understand is the way the execution context is created, right? So the execution context is created in two phases. All right. The first phase is the creation phase. What happens in the creation phase is that, okay, we look at the javascript, the execution context. It sees that we have this variable available and we have this function defined. So some space is reserved in the memory for these variables and these functions. So these functions and variables are loaded in the memory at that point of time. So it sees that, it scans through this code, it sees that, okay, this function is available. So it just loads that function in the memory. And it also sees that this variable is available, right? And it just loads that variable in the memory and sets its value to undefined, right? So loads variables and functions in memory, and then in the execution phase, right, it executes the statements line by line. Okay, right? So that is why when the actual code execution happens, that is in the execution phase. So it sees that this variable has already been loaded in the memory. The default value, okay, since nothing at this point of time, this statement has not been executed, right? So since this statement has not been executed, it has access to the variable, and by default, when you have not specified any value for a variable, it is set to undefined. Okay, this is the default value whenever you do not set any value for a variable. So that is why we get this statement undefined. Then we are calling this function. Now this function was already loaded in the memory, right? So that is why we have this function. It calls this function, it executes this statement, and it sees that even at this point of time, since this statement has not been executed yet, that is why the value is still undefined. Now what if I write a console.log statement over here and print some variable right now? Okay, you can see that initially for this statement it is undefined. Now this function invocation has happened, still it is undefined. Then it has executed this statement, which is basically setting the value to this variable, and the value is Devsnest. And then when we're calling the log statement, it is printing the result as Devsnest. All right. So this is how the execution works. The execution context is created. It is created in two phases, right? In the first phase, just space is reserved for variables and functions in the memory. They're loaded in the memory. Okay, and in the second phase, the statements are actually executed one after the other, right? So this is where actually this statement has been executed and this value has been set to this variable. And even now, if we say, if we call some function right now, you can once again see that it says from some function and it prints the value Devsnest. So if you read at other places about hoisting, you might read something like, this variable is lifted up to the top and something like that. That is not how things are working. It is not lifted to the top. It is because of the way the execution context is created. All right, so you guys need to remember this. The execution context is, the wrapper or the, environment which is responsible for executing a, set of statements, and it is created in two phases. So first phase is the creation phase and the other phase is the execution phase. All right, then we have uh, so basically this is a bad practice, right, to do something like this, but because of the way the execution context is created, this is possible. So let me just move this back to the top. So whenever you're writing code in general, do not, do the declaration later on and try to access the variable before the declaration. That is not a good approach. And let me have set this back, and now you can see all of the variables are having the proper values set. So this is important. And then what we need to understand is that whenever a function is created, a new execution context is created for that. And let's take a look and understand all of those things with another example. Let me just comment this out and leave it here. So suppose we have a function, okay, which is print name. All right, and let's create a variable where my name equals Gaurav, for example. And then we have a function which just says print name, and we will say console.log my name, like this. And we have another function, print another name, and it just say let's create a variable over here where my name equals, for example, John, and we will say console.log my name. Okay, then we have print some other name, and we will say where my name equals, for example, Jane. And then we have log my name, like this. Okay, and what we're doing is we are calling print another name from print name, and then print another name basically calls print some other name. Okay, and then lastly what we will do is we'll say console.log my name, and let's call print name function as well. Okay, so you can see that when we come across this statement, right, so over here the execution context is created. So we have the global execution context, right? So even if I say this dot my name over here, you can still see it is printing Gaurav, right? All right. So anyways, I just wanted to clear that out of the way. So we have variable my name equals Gaurav. Then we have this function, and this function. When this statement is executed, it logs this value. Then we are calling print name. So since, this variable and they are in the same lexical scope, right? This function, they're in the same lexical scope. They're at the same level where this function has been defined, right? It is able to use this value within this function. Okay, and when it logs this, we can see the value as Gaurav. Okay. Similarly, after this, it calls print another name. Now, what has happened over here is that now, as I mentioned earlier, for each function, a new execution context is created. And when the execution context is created, it scans through this code. It, creates those variables, reserve space for those variables in the memory. And it then it in the execution phase, it executes the statement one after the other. So it sees that there's this variable my name in the execution context for this particular function. And when we're calling console.log my name, this one is available right there in its execution context, right? So instead of Gaurav, it is logging the value John. And similarly over here, when this function is being executed, before it is executed, a separate execution context is created. Space is reserved for variables and functions, right? And then each statement is executed, right, line by line. So this variable has the value set to Jane, and then when we say console.log my name, it is printing Jane. Now, to understand better how different execution contexts are created, let's go to the sources tab. Let me zoom this out slightly, and so you can make use of the shortcut Control P or Command P for Mac, and just open the file main.js. Okay, we have access to all of these variables and functions. Let me add a couple of breakpoints. Okay. What we are interested in. All right, so we can see all of these breakpoints. Let me expand this and let's do a refresh. So you can see that the first execution context that has been created, which is the global execution context, right? So this is the first execution context. Whenever a new execution context is created, it is stacked on top of that. Okay, and so on, right? So what we will do is let me add the breakpoint on the first line itself. All right, so you can see that this particular line is highlighted, and to execute the lines one by one, you can make use of this, this key basically. You can press this button and it will move on to the next line. Okay, so you can see that when I try to, let me add a watch over here. Let me log this variable over here. You can see that we're in the global execution context. There is something known as if you look at the call stack, okay, So over here, this represents the execution context. You can think of it as that, right? This is the execution context, okay, the global execution context for this entire file. Then if we look at this variable, this represents the window, and within this we have this variable lm my name, right? Over here you can see that this has been created, and similarly we should be seeing all of the functions which we have created as well, like print name, print another name, and print some other function. Okay, these are all the functions which have been created at the global level. All right, so as we are executing a code, so let me move on to the next statement. Let me also open the console row here. Okay. And you can see that as I move on to the next statement, it executed this statement and this value was logged to the console. So you can see Gaurav is printed over here. Then we are on this statement right now. It has not been executed yet. If we press F10, right, or move on to the next statement which is to be executed, you can see that we are inside this print name function, and you can see this was the first execution context, the initial execution context. On top of that, this print name function has been stacked because it's basically creating a new execution context. All right, and you can see that we executed the statement. So once again you can see that Gaurav has been logged to the console. Okay, now we are executing this next statement, which is print another name. And what you see is after print name, a new execution context has been created and it has been stacked on top of the previous one. Okay, so the execution for this particular function was paused right here, okay, because it called this function. So the execution of the statements for this function has kind of stopped right here, and now it is executing the statements which are in this statement. So even now you see that this print name function is available, right? So on top of that, this new execution context has been stacked, which is created by this function. Okay, and this variable has been reserved, space for this has been reserved in this in the memory, and as we are executing it now, this variable has this value set. Okay, and when we're doing console.log over here, the statement was executed. You can see the value John being logged over here. Then this statement will be executed next, and the execution for this function will be paused, right? So as I press F10, you can see that we have another new execution context sort of available over here. This is known as the call stack, but just to explain you the concept of execution context, which is also similar to the way things are stacked. So we have the global execution context, then a context for the print name, then print another name, and we have a new context. So these contexts are also stacked on top of each other. So over here the same thing happens, and then it logs this in the console like this, and we see the value Jane, right? So we are still in this function right now. Only once we move out of this, right, what you will notice is let me add a few more breakpoints here and here. So now let me execute this statement. So the moment this function's execution has been completed, it has popped off, its execution context has been popped off the stack. So you can see that we no longer see print some other name over here. Then this was the last statement, right? This function call was the last statement. When the execution for this function is complete, you can see that it has been popped off the stack, and we are back to the last statement for this function, print name. Let me execute that as well, and you can see that it has been popped off the stack as well. And once again, we are back to our main execution stack, which is this one, and let's complete that as well. So now the complete execution has been done, and we can see like these are the values which have been printed, right? Now suppose what I do is from from this variable, right, this function over here, right, from this function, suppose I get rid of this statement. Okay, what do you guys expect the output to be? You can let me know in the comments. You can take a look at this code. We will be logging my name first. So the value for my name is Gaurav. Then we are calling print name, right? Then it has the set of statements. So over here, what is the value? It will be Gaurav over here. Then it calls this function. Here a new execution context is created, right? And it will log the value John. And once again, this function is calling print some other name, right? And we are logging this my name over here. So what is the expected output for this? So some of you guys are saying that this should print John. Some of you are saying it should print Gaurav, Gaurav, John, and then Gaurav once again. So the guys who are saying that the value for this, the last execution should be Gaurav, you guys are correct, because you can see that as I had explained to you earlier, when an execution context is created, it has access to this global object, this variable, and a reference to the outer environment, right? So over here, if you see, when the execution context for this thing is, for this particular function is created, all right, so at the global level, as let me just quickly come to this, let me get rid of all of these breakpoints. So we are here, right, and you can see all of these functions have been loaded, and the execution contexts are stacked. Now when it is creating the when it is executing this particular statement, it also has access to something known as the outer environment, right? So it tries to search for this variable within its execution context. It does not find it, right? Then what it does is that it sees that what is my outer environment in this case. So this function, if you see, it is lexically sitting at the same level. Okay, this function is defined at the same level as this variable. Okay, now as I mentioned, the global execution context is global, right? That means it is accessible to everyone, right? And this function it created, even though we are calling print some other name, from print another name, it has its own execution context. And if you see this variable, right, my name equals John, this has a different lexical environment compared to this, right? These two, this statement is not at the same level as this statement, right? This is inside this curly bracket. So curly brackets, a pair of curly brackets, it creates a different scope, right? So this is the global scope, and this is the scope, for this particular function, right? A scope basically defines the it defines where of variable is accessible and where it is restricted to. Basically it basically tells us where this variable lives. All right, this is what a scope tells us. So you can see that this is creating a different scope, right? And what you can easily see, the thing which can help you is that the lexical environment, this has a different lexical environment compared to this. So if you see, this variable will not be available within this function, okay, since they are on different lexical environments. So since the outer environment for this is the the global execution, right, the lexical environment available to this is the outermost level, right? That is why it has access to this variable, right? The outer environment, it has access to its outer environment, which is nothing but the global execution context in this case, right? And it finds this my name variable is available in that space, basically, right? That is why you can see once again the value that it has is Gaurav, okay, and not the value John, as they are in different execution context, and this execution context is at a different lexical scope compared to this particular, in comparison to this function. All right, so if we execute this statement, you can see that we have Gaurav, Gaurav, John, and then Gaurav once again, right? So if you guys are still not clear as to what is going on, let's take a look at this using a diagram. So let me just copy all of these statements. Okay, let's let me make this small and let me turn this into a piece of code. All right, so we have this code available to us. Then let's take a look at the execution context, right? So we have something known as the global execution context. Okay, so at the global level, right, this is where all of the functions are defined, right? And we have this variable over here. So let me just copy this and let me paste it here. So this variable is available at the global level and its value equals Gaurav. Similarly, when this function gets executed, it creates a separate execution context for this. Let me copy this and let's try to. So this is the execution context for this print name function, right? And the story for this and this function is the same, right? So when it creates the execution context, it sees that, this variable is not available over here. It tries to see it in its outer environment, whether it's available. So it has access to its outer environment. So basically, it will have access to this variable, right? And when it tries to access my name, it will find reference to this variable over here, right? Similarly, when print another name is loaded, now this has its own copy of my name and the value is John, right? So when this is being logged, so when this is it's being logged, it sees that it is available right within its own execution context. Okay, so it logs that to the console and we see the value as John. Now once again it comes to this function and similar to this, right? So you can see this over here, and when it tries to access my name, it has a reference to the outermost variable right here. And it finds the value for that variable is Gaurav, and it will log that in the console. Okay. So if we define the variable my name once again over here, right? It will be created in its own execution context and the value will be available right there. So these are the different execution contexts. This is the first one. Then when this function gets called, this is stacked on top of that, and within that, this one is called, right? And this thing, right? This thing of having access of this variable of, from here, this is known as the scope chain, right? So even though this variable is not defined over here, but since this is at the same lexical scope as this variable and we have access to the outer environment for all of the execution context, it tries to look for that variable in its outer environment, which is basically the global execution context, and it finds that variable over there. So this is known as the scope chain. Okay, it will look for that variable within its own scope, right? Which is this function over here. If it doesn't find it, it will look in the scope chain. So it will find that this is available right here and print it. If it is not available even within its scope chain, then you will get the value as undefined. All right. Now let's take another example of this. So suppose I move this function within print another name function, right? And what I do is I am calling this right here, and we have the same statement. Let me save this. Let's go to the browser. Let me kill this. And if we go to the console, if you look at the code now, right, we're calling print name. So it prints first, it prints this Gaurav, then print name prints Gaurav, then print another name is called. It creates a new execution context, right? We log the value John. Then if you see, this function has been defined within this function. This is known as a nested function. All right. And when we're logging console.log my name, so the execution context for this will be created. Now, if you see this function definition and the definition of this variable, they're in the same lexical scope, right? So the outer environment for this is this, print another name. This is the outer environment for this. So first it will search within its own scope, right, which is this one. Then it will check in the outer scope, which is this one. So it finds that this variable is available over here, and that is why we see the value being printed over here as John. Okay. All right. Is it, is it, does this clarify, how the outer variable is, how the outer environment is accessible? Now, for example, suppose I comment this out. Okay. And let me remove all the breakpoints. Okay, and now if you see in the console, the result for all the function calls is Gaurav. Okay, that is because so for this, you guys are clear about the first two statements, right? When print another name is called, once again it sees that this variable is not available in this scope. It tries to search for that in the outer environment, which would be the global execution context. It finds it right here. Now the same thing happens for this function, right? So it will search within its own scope. It does not find it here. Then it sees that this is the outer environment for this function. It does not find it here as well. Then it sees that the outer environment for this is the global, the global execution context, which is this at this level. So it sees that my name is available over here, and then it prints the value as Gaurav over here. All right. So that is how, things work. So this entire concept of, having access to variables where they are not defined and looking them up in the, outer reference, this is known as scope chaining. All right. So all these scopes are chained. So you can see that the scope for this function is chained to, this one, and then this one is chained to the outer environment. So this direction, right, this linking of, or the references which are available to us from within the execution context to the outer environment, this is known as scope chaining. All right. So is this clear to you guys? Okay, so most of you guys are saying that it is clear. So I am hoping that this is clear, because this is quite, this is quite an important topic. And it makes, it you should take efforts to understand this, because this is the basis for some of the future concepts which we'll be learning later on, such as closures and a few other concepts as well. All right, so going back to the beginning of our topic, let me just comment this out. If you notice that with this way of doing things, it is possible to have the variable declaration later on and actually log the variable before that. Let me just uncomment this once again. Sorry, this one. Yeah, so if you notice over here that it is possible to make such sort of calls, and this code still works, right? Even though the declaration has happened later on, and we are invoking the function before the declaration has happened, we're trying to access the variable before before it has been declared. This kind of behavior is unpredictable, right? And it creates a lot of confusion. For that purpose, we are recommended to make use of the let and const variables, right? So if you try to do something like this for the let variable, for example, okay, now if I save this, you can see that right here I'm getting an error. It's telling me uncaught reference error, cannot access some variable before initialization. Okay, so this itself kind of takes care of the hoisting or the issues which the errors and the confusion which is created when we use the var declaration type. Okay, so the only way that this will work correctly is when we have the statement like this, and now you can see that the exception has it has gone, right? Similarly, if I move the function before the variable declaration and I call this, once again it's giving me this exception, and it's not able to access this variable, right? Because it has been declared, the declaration type is let. So the let and const variable, they do not work like how the var works. During the creation phase, if no value is assigned to that variable, it basically gives us a reference error. Okay, so the value needs to be so if we try to access the variable before it has been declared, it will give us a reference error because it does not set the initial value as undefined. So for example, this is all right, okay, if I do not define, or if I do not assign any value, this is all right, okay. And if I invoke the function over here, this is fine, okay, this will work because this variable has been declared. Some function will be executed by default. When the variable has been declared, the default value is set to undefined, right? And the reference has been set to undefined, right? But if we try to access this statement, and at this level this variable has not been declared yet, so therefore its reference is not available. That is why it gives us this reference unavailable, and it gives us that this cannot be accessed before initialization, right? So if the declaration is done, so at the creation phase, for the let and for the let type of variable, if no initial value is set, it sets the initial value as undefined. That is why this code then works properly without any exception. Okay, and then later on, if we are saying, so for example, over here we're saying some variable equals devs nest, for example, you can see that initially it is undefined, but when this function has been called, we have set this variable's value to devsnest, and it says from some function, and it logs the correct value for this variable. And even if we call console.log some variable over here, you can see once again it will print devs nest because the assignment has happened over here. Okay, so to avoid errors, you make use of let. And in case of const, if I change this to const, right, this will not work because a constant variable's value cannot be changed, right? It cannot be reassigned. So if I save this, it is giving us this exception, right? So when we make use of const, the value needs to be defined right there. Okay, and if I save this, you can see that it prints devnest, and then it says uh, and if I try to do a reassignment over here, so this statement goes through successfully. So we can see that all of these statements are executed line by line. When it tries to execute this function, we're doing a reassignment to a constant variable, which is not allowed. So if I get rid of this, we can once again see that it prints the correct value, and then it prints the correct value over here. So the latest versions of JavaScript had introduced const and let declaration types, which avoids all of these confusions, and it is recommended that you guys make use of these variables. There are some exceptional situations wherein we might want to um declare variables at the global level using var, but in most cases this is where we declare those variables. All right, so is it clear to you guys? You can let me know. I think we covered quite a lot of, it was a pretty uh, deep session but I think it is important for you guys to understand the difference between the way an execution context is created, how variables are loaded in memory, how functions are loaded in memory, and how they're executed, and what is the lexical scope, why all of those things matter, and how they affect the access of variables and functions. Okay, yeah, so let will always change is a a declaration type whose value we can reassign. Okay, it's not necessary to reassign it, but it is something which can be reassigned. When we use const, it basically means that throughout the execution of that particular code, that value will remain constant and you cannot reassign it. So let is useful. For example, you set the initial value of, suppose you want to take sum of all the numbers in an array, right? So you declare let sum equals 0, and then as you go through all of the items in the array, you add the items value to the sum, right? And you're reassigning the sum variable. So that is where you can make use of let. And const is for constant values. For example, you want to use the value of pi for some calculation, so you can define that as const, right? Because it will remain, this value will remain constant. And it has some performance benefits as well in terms of JavaScript when you declare a variable as const, right? uh, we'll not go into the details for that, but yeah, that is the difference between and const. And I even showed you where you guys can use var, and when you and the issues with the var declaration type. Okay, so let's end the session over here, and I'll see you guys in the Discord channel. If in case you guys have any doubts, we'll cover the doubts over there. If you don't know where to join the Discord channel, you can see the details in the video, right? You'll find the information in the details of this video. So that is it. I'll see you guys tomorrow and immediately in the Discord channel. Okay, so good night and bye bye.